you will see liberal journalists, progressive journalists, mainstream media figures who insist that crime is really not an everyday occurrence in Washington, D.C. and in other cities in America. We have a justice system that unfortunately has been perverted to do everything possible to release people like DeCarlos Brown into the general population as speedily as possible. Now, why is this something that we have to tolerate? Why do we not, in fact, put people like DeCarlos Brown in prison or in padded cells or indeed on death row? Law and order has been on Americans' minds throughout the summer, and a recent incident at the end of August has really put a spotlight on just how bad crime in America's cities has become. There was this terrible incident in Charlotte, North Carolina, where a 23-year-old Ukrainian refugee, Irina Zarutska was her name, was simply coming onto a train. She sat down, and then the man behind her took out a knife and stabbed her in the neck and killed her. That killer's name was DeCarlos Brown, and this was someone who had already been arrested 14 times before he murdered Irina. Now, this is obviously a failure of the justice system, but we've seen an enormous response, both on social media and from the traditional media, that's quite distinct. On the one hand, the social media have been saying that this is a murder that America needs to sit up and take notice of, while much of the traditional media was very slow to take notice. And in fact, there has been a certain resistance among traditional media, in newspapers and on television networks, news networks in particular, where progressive journalists, liberal journalists have said, why is this murder particularly noteworthy? There are so many murders in America. Why should this one generate special attention? And is the fact that the victim is white and the perpetrator is black, does that make this simply a racial incident that is being promoted by people on social media who may have a racial agenda rather than being simply concerned about crime? Hi, I'm Dan McCarthy, the editor of Modern Age. Please smash that like button and promote this podcast on YouTube and in all other venues as well. And take note, Modern Age is available not only as a podcast, but also as a print magazine and as a website with daily articles. You can visit the website at www.modernagejournal.com. Again, that's modernagejournal.com. And our print magazine is published every 3 months, in which you can find the most thoughtful conservative philosophy, history, writing about literature and other culture that you will encounter anywhere in the written word. Thank you. Well, the reason this horrible murder is getting so much attention is really threefold. First of all, there's the fact that the victim in this case is someone who is a particularly tragic and just shocking case. This is a woman, 23 years old, who has come to America as a refugee, fleeing from a war zone, fleeing from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and she expected to find a safe haven in our country. She thought she was leaving behind a world of violence and coming to a first world country in which a young woman could take her safety for granted on public transportation. And of course, she was entirely wrong about the real character of America in the year 2025. In fact, a refugee, a young woman, is not safe on America's public transportation system in a city like Charlotte, North Carolina, or indeed in hundreds of our cities across the nation because of this endemic crime problem. So the tragedy of her life as someone who had sought refuge from violence, someone who had sought to flee a land in which death could strike at any moment, come to America and live peacefully, live in safety. This, of course, is something that is particularly a pull upon the heartstrings of anyone who's aware of what's happened. But there's another facet to this as well, which also is, I think, making this case particularly noteworthy. Naturally, the fact that it's caught on video is also something that makes it all the more attention-grabbing. So we actually see the scenes of Irina getting on the train. We see the man behind her muttering to himself and then fiddling with a knife, and then ultimately rising up, raising his hand, and about to strike her. There's even footage of the knife dripping with blood afterwards as this man walks through the train and boasts of having killed a white girl. So the fact that it's caught on tape, that this is documented, and this is a nightmare made real by video and by audio, certainly makes it additionally noteworthy as well. But beyond those 2 points, there is the fact that this crime is emblematic, and that's the most noteworthy thing of all. This is not like the George Floyd incident. It's not like, in fact, a number of incidents which the mainstream media gave enormous amounts of attention to during the Barack Obama years and the first Trump administration. Those were incidents during the Obama and early Trump years where you had African Americans who were killed by police in the course of making an arrest. Now, those incidents were very unrepresentative. It's actually quite rare for police to kill anyone in the course of making an arrest, let alone an unarmed black person. But the media presented these cases as if they were, in fact, emblems of a deeply racist nation, of a nation in which law enforcement was routinely threatening the lives of African Americans and of other minorities. Well, in fact, what happened to Irina on that train in Charlotte, North Carolina, is in fact much more emblematic of the situation that exists in America's cities. It's true in the city where I live, in Washington, D.C. It's true of cities in California, whether it's Los Angeles or San Francisco or others. It's true of cities in the middle of the country as well. I know St. Louis very well. It's true of cities in Tennessee, cities all throughout the land. These are places where you will find there are individuals who are mentally disturbed, who have extensive criminal records, and yet who are wandering into the population. They are not behind bars. They are not in padded cells. They are in a position where they can strike at any moment. And whether they strike at any moment is simply a matter of what's going on in their minds on a given day. It's not something over which society has any control. These are elements which are simply powder kegs ready to explode at any moment. And Americans who are accustomed to this, who live in our cities, know how to deal with it. They know that, for example, if you are riding on public transportation, you want to take notice of who's sitting around you and especially who is sitting behind you. If it's somebody who's muttering to himself, if it's somebody who's fidgeting, who seems to have problems going on in his head, you might realize that you want to be either to move seats or to be very careful about any sudden movements that this individual behind you makes. Now, Irina was coming from a country where, even though it's war-torn, and even though Ukraine has plenty of crime of its own, it simply doesn't have this kind of ever-present menace that we have in America's inner cities, and in fact, not just in the inner cities, but even in the suburbs, even in what are supposedly the nice places of the nation's capital in Washington, D.C. You have to be aware of your surroundings. You have to be aware of who is sitting behind you on public transportation. You have to be attentive enough that you might realize, well, look, you would enjoy looking at your cell phone, perhaps. You would enjoy listening to music on your headphones. But that simply isn't a wise thing to do on America's public transportation systems. Instead, you have to have your ears out for any kind of trouble. Anyone who starts, for example, shouting uncontrollably or muttering under his breath in a way that seems to indicate that he's having a conversation with someone who doesn't exist. You also have to keep your eyes open for any kinds of disruptions, disturbances, people pulling out weapons. This is important because the way that crime is reported in the traditional media, the mainstream media, the liberal media, is highly unrepresentative and in fact gives people a very confused notion of exactly what's going on in America's cities. So you'll often see liberal journalists say that Washington, D.C., yes, it has elevated crime, but in fact, it's not the maximum zenith of elevated crime that it's had over the last several decades. And in fact, crime is only as bad, perhaps, as it was back in 1992, which was in fact already a very high crime period. If you look at crime in Washington, D.C., and I mentioned D.C. as an example because I'm very familiar with it as someone who's lived here for more than 20 years, Washington, D.C. has a crime rate that's more than double that of the nation as a whole. It has a violent crime rate that's about triple that of the nation as a whole. It's between 2 times and 3 times that of the whole nation. And these are the numbers that are reported. There are many incidents, many crimes in Washington, D.C. that go unreported simply because people take them for granted. Even so, you will see liberal journalists, progressive journalists, mainstream media figures who insist that crime is really not an everyday occurrence in Washington, D.C. and in other cities in America. What they claim is that, well, you're statistically, you are unlikely to be carjacked. Yes, there are too many carjackings in Washington, D.C. There are carjackings of Uber drivers. There are carjackings of just ordinary people, government workers and others who might be traveling on Capitol Hill or in the vicinity of the White House. Yes, it does happen, but it doesn't happen every day, and it's not something that the ordinary person needs to dread and expect to have happen to them. Well, that's true. Statistically speaking, you might be unlikely to be carjacked on a given day. But actually, based on, again, my experience of 20 plus years in the Washington, D.C. area, you are extremely likely to encounter a disturbed person on a regular basis in Washington, D.C. On any given day of the week, you might stumble across either a junkie or someone who has a pronounced mental illness who's wandering the streets, or you might encounter young people who are behaving, teenagers who are behaving in a particularly aggressive and troublemaking fashion. Now, most of the time, these incidents don't lead to the commission of a crime. They don't lead to any attacks upon citizens. But the menace and the threat is always there. And if you're used to living in America's cities, you know that on any given moment, the psychopath or the mentally disturbed person that you run across just on any given day in one of America's cities, that person might be carrying a knife. And this might be the day that not only is that person carrying a knife, but they decide to wield it, to brandish it, to use it against you or one of your loved ones or anyone in the public. This is something that can take place at any moment in America's cities. The fact that it doesn't happen more often is not a sign that we are a healthy society. It's actually a sign that we are simply waiting for these powder kegs to explode. Now, why is this something that we have to tolerate? Why do we not, in fact, put people like DeCarlos Brown in prison or in padded cells or indeed on death row? Well, first of all, I want to point out that there's this tendency, again in the mainstream media, to make cases like DeCarlo Brown's entirely about mental illness and to say, well, this is just a person who is disturbed. He was having a bad brain day and happened to lash out and murder someone in that moment. But really, this is not something that is, a sort of a long-standing or widespread problem. This is just a freak incident with someone who is disturbed. Well, mental illness certainly is a component of the violence in America's cities and the danger that ordinary Americans face every day in our cities. But it's a component that is mixed in with other things as well. So someone like DeCarlos Brown also had a very extensive criminal record. Chances are, now I don't know this particularly to be true in Mr. Brown's case, but it certainly is true of many of the mentally disturbed individuals you encounter in Washington, D.C. and in other American cities. I highly suspect, however, that DeCarlos Brown was also a drug user, almost certainly using marijuana, probably using harder drugs as well. Certainly, if you go to Washington, D.C.'s Union Station, and it happens to be a day when the National Guard is not deployed, you will see plenty of individuals who are both mentally disturbed and who are drug addicts, and who probably have criminal records as well. So this is not simply a matter of saying that mental illness is insufficiently diagnosed and inadequately treated in America. Mental illness is a component here, but again, there is much more going on as well. And it's a matter of each of these elements exacerbating the others. So if you have someone who is somewhat mentally disturbed but not completely insane, and they subject themselves to a regime of daily intake of highly potent marijuana, if they then acquire a criminal record, if they get used to treating other people as if they are not worthy of respect, and as if the addict or the insane person is entitled to kind of force his way into the streets and to do what he wishes on public transportation, being however loud, however obnoxious, and ultimately however dangerous as he wishes. When you have that kind of attitude that becomes inculcated in people, when it becomes habitual in people who already have mental disturbances and who may be using drugs, you have a recipe for the kinds of violent explosions that happened in Charlotte, North Carolina, and that cost Irina her life. Now, obviously, there is a crime problem here, but there is also, unfortunately, a political problem. The justice system failed Irina, and it fails Americans every single day in this country when it puts people like DeCarlos Brown out on the streets and allows them to circulate on our public transportation. This man had been arrested 14 times. He'd been convicted of everything from shoplifting to armed robbery. And yet he was not behind bars where he would have been prevented from committing a murder on an innocent person like Irina. Instead, DeCarlos Brown slipped through, it's not even accurate to say he slipped through the cracks of the justice system. We have a justice system that unfortunately has been perverted to do everything possible to release people like DeCarlos Brown into the general population as speedily as possible. And it's designed not to restrain them. It's designed not to put them into mental asylums, not to put them in prison, not to put them on death row, but instead to facilitate their release into the general population where they can commit mayhem and indeed murder. Now, this is something that judges, this is something that political activists, and it's something that especially one of our political parties has concocted. This is something that hasn't happened just by accident. It hasn't happened just by complacency on the part of citizens. No, in fact, there are entire legal movements. There are entire movements of anti-police activists, people who wanted to defund the police, and who now are basically pursuing the same kind of agenda, however, under a less flamboyant slogan. There are organizations that are constantly trying to tie the hands of law enforcement and do things like abolish bail, say that we're not going to have cash bail anymore. If you get arrested, you just get returned to the streets the day that you get arrested. All sorts of progressive, liberal, left-wing movements that are actually strengthening the legal position of criminals, that are actually making it easier for criminals to be released into the general population. All of these movements are extremely powerful. They are networked. They have support from people like George Soros. I've seen reports talking about North Carolina in particular that says some of Soros's organizations have focused on activism and organization in North Carolina, trying to basically shift the justice system away from a system of detention and punishment to a system of rehabilitation and release, a system that will in fact not constrain criminals, but will make them basically free agents within the general population where they are at liberty to again commit mayhem and murder. There's a big political problem here, and it's a political problem that's compounded when there is a lack of democratic political accountability, small d democratic political accountability, but also frankly capital D democratic political accountability. Now, when it comes to someone who is a mayor or a governor or even a president that has a party label next to their name, it's easy enough for the public to recognize that a particular political party might be associated with soft-on-crime policies and with policies that lead to murders such as Irina's. But there are also, of course, many officials whose party label is hidden or is not displayed at all. This is often true with judges. It's also true of many behind-the-scenes officials who are responsible for many of the policies that actually go into effect in our cities and indeed in our nation as a whole. Now, we saw a rather shocking development at the very end of the Joe Biden presidential administration. Joe Biden was out the door. This is January of 2025. It's shortly before Donald Trump is sworn in as president. And what does President Biden do? He issues a mass commutation of more than 4,000 federal prisoners, basically changing their sentences, in some cases not just reducing their sentences, but even reducing their sentences to a point where they will be immediately released. Joe Biden issues a record-breaking number of commutations and of pardons. And he claims in January that he is doing this for supposedly nonviolent drug offenders. But you know what? His own Justice Department contradicts that. And recent coverage in the New York Post has pointed out that there are emails and memos from Biden's Justice Department, first of all saying that they were not consulted on these pardons and commutations before they happened, and second saying that retroactively, as they've looked at these commutations and pardons, they've noticed that in fact there are a number of violent criminals who were recipients of clemency from President Biden. Now, President Biden is not going to return to office. He obviously is not capable of returning to office, even if he decided that he once again wanted to try to run for president. And of course, Joe Biden was not really in charge of his own administration during the 4 years that he was president. It was already clear, I think, to people who looked at the 2020 election critically that Joe Biden was nowhere near the mental acuity that he possessed when he was vice president for Barack Obama. He had declined significantly in the 4 years between the end of the Obama administration and 2020. But of course, during the course of Biden's own presidency, from 2021 to January of 2025, Biden gets progressively worse. And ultimately, he's so bad that in a summer debate with Donald Trump in 2024, Biden's performance is so pathetic that, in fact, he ultimately has to withdraw from running for re-election, and his vice president, Kamala Harris, instead steps up to be the Democratic nominee last year. But of course, the terrible thing here is that not only did you have someone in Biden's condition acting as president for 4 years, or at least having his name on the presidential administration, but even after it was publicly exposed just how deficient Biden's capacities had become, he still remained president. And in fact, instead of resigning, which was the thing that he should have done, which would have been the appropriate thing, Joe Biden remained in office even though he was not capable of discharging the duties of being president. This means that, in fact, a lot of legislation, a lot of executive orders, and then ultimately this record-breaking number of pardons and commutations, all of this was signed and issued not by Joe Biden, but by the auto pen. The auto pen is an automated signature. It's meant to be a representative of the president. It's meant to be the president's automated signature being given to documents. But of course, the president, and precisely because it is automated, the president isn't necessarily personally directly applying the auto pen. Anyone could potentially use it. And that's what we see in the Biden administration. So there are serious questions that have been raised, not only about the fact that these pardons and commutations that Biden issued were not vetted by the Justice Department, but also there's the serious question of whether Joe Biden even knew what pardons and commutations were being issued. Who was actually compiling the list of people to be pardoned and to have their sentences commuted? Who was actually responsible for granting clemency to a record-breaking number of federal criminals? We don't know. And this is something that the Trump administration is now investigating. It's something that is beginning to come out in the press, in reporting in places like the New York Post and in Axios. But clearly this is a matter of great importance because, again, while Joe Biden claimed that these were nonviolent drug offenders that he was releasing, in fact, there are indications and proof that many of these offenders were, in fact, violent criminals. And some of them, even if they had not committed violence yet, are people who probably are in a high-risk category. Again, DeCarlos Brown had been arrested on a number of violent charges, but he had not gone anywhere near as far as committing murder until he took Irina's life. Now we have a number of people who have been released into the general population, a number of convicts who've been released by Joe Biden in January of this year, who are, again, ticking time bombs who might very well commit those same kinds of crimes. It's necessary to find out exactly who was behind these commutations and pardons that Joe Biden's auto pen issued, and it's necessary to hold all politicians, of all parties in fact, accountable for crime, and to make sure that we no longer see individuals like DeCarlos Brown able to continue to roam free after 14 arrests and ultimately plunge a knife into the neck of someone like Irina.